What if the person who lived next door to you, someone you trusted, someone you saw every day, was hiding a dark secret? What if that person was the last person you would ever suspect? Oak Ridge was a town where life was slow and easy, where the houses lined the streets like pieces in a well-organized puzzle. Perfect lawns, tidy homes, and families who never seemed to need anything more than the occasional chat at the mailbox or a coffee with the neighbor. It was the kind of place where you never worried about what went on behind closed doors, because in Oak Ridge, everyone was just as they appeared. At least, that's how it seemed. But on October 14th, 2007, something happened that would shake Oak Ridge to its very core. The Martins, a seemingly perfect family who had lived on Elm Street for over 5 years, vanished. They didn't leave a note, they didn't make a call, and they didn't pack up their belongings. The house was left in the same state as always. Their cars were parked in the driveway, and when the neighbors checked on them, there was no sign of a struggle, no indication that anything was wrong. It was like they had simply disappeared. The Martins consisted of Brian, a 39-year-old software engineer, his wife, Alicia, a 36-year-old elementary school teacher, and their 11-year-old daughter, Zoe. They were the perfect neighbors, the ones who helped carry in groceries, who made sure the lawn was mowed, and who waved with a smile every time you passed by. No one thought twice about them until the night they were gone. The first sign that something was wrong came from a neighbor, Janet, who had always exchanged pleasantries with Alicia whenever they met in passing. She had been trying to get in touch with her for a few days, wondering if they wanted to come over for coffee, but Alicia never answered. The phone calls went to voicemail, and no one responded to the knocks at the door. When Janet finally went over to check, she found the door ajar. The house was eerily quiet. There were no signs of the family. The kitchen lights were on, the TV was running in the living room, and Zoe's backpack was still by the front door. The unsettling sight led her to call the police. But the search didn't yield immediate results. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransom note, just empty rooms and unanswered questions. Detective Samantha Pierce was called to the scene. She had seen missing persons cases before, but this one was different. It wasn't just the vanishing of a person, it was the disappearance of an entire family, and that in itself raised an entirely new set of questions. Where had they gone? Why hadn't anyone heard from them? The first step was to speak with the neighbors. Most of them were shaken by the fact that no one had seen anything unusual. But one neighbor, Carl Hargrove, seemed to have an odd way of talking about the family. He had been living next door to the Martins for nearly 10 years. But when questioned, Carl's demeanor stood out. He wasn't overtly nervous, but there was something about his responses that seemed rehearsed, as though he was holding something back. Carl had never had a problem with the Martins, he claimed. He had spoken to Brian on several occasions, usually about minor things like the weather or his garden. But when asked about the night the family disappeared, his answers became more elusive. He mentioned seeing Brian leave the house around 8 p.m., but when asked for more details, he shifted the conversation back to neutral ground. He just left, Carl had said. I didn't think much of it. He was probably going to grab something from the store or whatever. It's normal, right? There was nothing abnormal about the statement, but it bothered Pierce. It was too easy, too casual. Carl's house was just a few feet away, and yet, he hadn't seen anything more? No unusual car pulling up, no strange activity? But the true mystery would begin when the police searched Carl's property. They found a broken window in his garage. It seemed harmless at first. A little crack in the glass, nothing that screamed crime scene, but when Pierce and her team investigated further, they realized the window had been broken recently. There was something suspicious about it. Inside Carl's garage, hidden beneath piles of old furniture, the police discovered several crates, none of them labeled. They were stacked high in the corner of the garage, and when officers opened them, they found old surveillance tapes. The tapes weren't from any standard security system. They were dated, they looked old, and they were clearly from hidden cameras around the Martins' house. The footage was grainy, but there, caught on tape, was Carl, standing outside the Martins' home late at night, watching. Pierce immediately questioned Carl again. This time, his story started to unravel. He had claimed that he had never been in the Martins' house, but the tapes told a different story. The hidden cameras had been placed in strategic locations around the property, watching the comings and goings of the family, monitoring their routines, and perhaps even documenting their private lives. Carl denied any involvement, of course. He claimed the cameras were for security, but Pierce wasn't buying it. Carl had installed the cameras months before the family vanished, well before any tensions or disturbances had been noticed. And why did he need to monitor the Martins' every move? The questions began to stack up. "Why were you watching them, Carl?" Pierce asked. Carl's response was cold, calculated. "I was just looking out for them. They were good neighbors. We had a good rapport." But there was something about the way Carl said, "good neighbors," that made Pierce shiver. It was too rehearsed. He knew something, and he wasn't talking. The next few days were filled with dead ends. The Martins' bank accounts had not been accessed. Their phones were still off, and there were no signs that they had planned a sudden departure. Their vehicle had remained parked at home. No one had seen them leave. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. But then the breakthrough came. Pierce received an anonymous tip. The call was brief but offered just enough to steer her in the right direction. The voice on the other end of the line claimed that Carl had been seen talking to someone the night the family disappeared. Someone whose face was unfamiliar to the neighbors. The tipster suggested that Carl had been acting strange in the days before the family vanished. He had been heard arguing with a man late at night, and the voices had been unusually loud. The tip was vague, but it was enough for Pierce to start connecting the dots. Carl wasn't just a bystander in this case. He was involved, and whoever he had been talking to that night knew something about the family's disappearance. When you start questioning everything, you realize how little you really know about the people who live closest to you. The truth doesn't always come with a bang. Sometimes, it whispers, and when it does, you have to listen carefully. The case had been dragging on for over a week, and Detective Samantha Pierce felt like she was chasing ghosts. The Martins had vanished without a trace, and every lead seemed to hit a dead end. The house was eerily quiet, with no new evidence to suggest what had happened. The neighborhood was still in shock, and the few who were willing to speak to the police seemed to be hiding something, avoiding the topic entirely. But it was the quiet that unnerved Pierce the most. The silence wasn't normal. It felt unnatural, like everyone was too afraid to talk. Carl Hargrove, the neighbor whose surveillance tapes had been found in the garage, remained a person of interest. But every time Pierce confronted him, his story remained the same. He was just a quiet neighbor who had no involvement in the family's disappearance. The footage had him standing by the Martins' house. Sure, but it didn't show anything incriminating. Yet, the more Pierce dug into Carl's life, the more she realized that his behavior was not just odd. It was deliberate. Carl had been a fixture in Oak Ridge for nearly a decade, but no one had ever really gotten to know him. His life was a closed book, and his neighbors were content to leave it that way. He was polite but distant, never engaging in conversations that went beyond pleasantries. No one could say they knew much about him. He had no known family, no close friends, and no connections to the community beyond the usual neighborly exchanges. The surveillance footage alone wasn't enough to charge Carl. Yet Pierce couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. The footage from the hidden cameras wasn't the only thing that caught her attention. There was something about Carl's history that raised alarms. His record, although not long, included a few incidents, mostly petty theft, some charges related to violent outbursts, but nothing that would have explained his sudden fixation on the Martins. After a few more interviews with neighbors, Pierce stumbled across something that no one had mentioned before. One of Carl's neighbors, a man named Patrick Ellis, told Pierce about a strange encounter he'd had with Carl in the days leading up to the Martins' disappearance. Patrick remembered seeing Carl and Brian Martin talking one evening by the mailbox. The conversation had seemed strained, almost as if Carl was trying to keep Brian from leaving. Patrick didn't think much of it at the time, but the way Carl had looked at Brian, that cold, almost calculating gaze, stuck with him. According to Patrick, Carl had never had a problem with anyone before. He was usually a loner, keeping to himself, but when he'd spoken to Brian, something had changed. Carl had acted almost desperate, like he was trying to convince Brian to stay put. But what was it? What did Carl want from Brian? Pierce decided to confront Carl once again. She was tired of the lies, tired of the games. Carl had been caught in a web of suspicion, and it was time to tear it apart. This time, Pierce approached Carl at his house, but he wasn't alone. His longtime neighbor, an elderly woman named Edna, was standing by the porch, watching the conversation with curiosity. Carl had grown visibly agitated when Pierce arrived, and his eyes darted to Edna as if seeking approval for his actions. But Pierce wasn't backing down. "Carl," Pierce began, "I know you're not telling me everything. I know you were involved in something you shouldn't have been. And I know you're hiding the truth about the Martins." Carl's face tightened at the accusation, but he didn't speak. Pierce could feel the tension mounting as Edna stepped forward, offering a subtle glance of support to Carl. Something about Edna's sudden involvement in the conversation didn't sit right with Pierce, but she chose to press on. "I'm going to ask you one last time, Carl. What do you know about the Martins? And why was your house bugged with cameras pointing right at their property?" Carl remained silent, but as Pierce stepped closer, something in his posture changed. He suddenly looked vulnerable, almost as if he were weighing his options. Then, without warning, he broke. "They were never supposed to find out," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I never wanted to hurt them." Pierce's heart raced as she leaned in. "What are you talking about, Carl?" Carl paused, his face tense, as if the weight of his actions had finally caught up to him. "I didn't mean for things to go this far, but when they started asking questions, I didn't know who else to turn to. I didn't think they would get involved." Suddenly, Carl stopped himself, realizing what he had just admitted. He backed away, his eyes wide with panic. "It's too late now. You can't stop it." Pierce's mind was spinning. Who was Carl talking about? Who else was involved? But before she could press him further, Carl turned and rushed into his house, slamming the door behind him. Edna, too, seemed unnerved by the encounter, casting a worried glance at Pierce. Pierce wasn't done. She needed to get inside Carl's house. She had to find out what he was hiding. She made her way to the back of the property, hoping to catch a glimpse of something that could lead her to the next piece of the puzzle. She was prepared to break in if necessary. But then, as she approached the back window, she froze. A faint light flickered from within the house, casting an unnatural glow in the otherwise darkened room. Pierce carefully peered through the window, trying to make out the shapes inside. What she saw was not what she expected. Inside the house, Carl was talking to someone. Someone Pierce hadn't expected to see. It was Gregory Miller. Miller had been Brian Martin's business partner, but Pierce had never seen any reason to connect him to the Martins' disappearance. They had met a few times during the investigation, but nothing had stood out. However, now, seeing him in Carl's house, she realized how wrong she had been. Carl and Gregory were in the middle of a heated conversation. Pierce could see their gestures, wide, frantic, and urgent. She couldn't hear their words, but the intensity of their body language told her everything. Something had happened. They were involved. And whatever it was, it had led to the disappearance of the Martins. Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who can hurt you the most. But what if the people you've always trusted are the ones keeping the darkest secrets? Detective Samantha Pierce knew that something didn't add up with Carl Hargrove. She had spent enough time investigating the Martins case to trust her instincts. The way Carl had reacted when confronted, the way he had suddenly become defensive and almost paranoid, made her think that the truth wasn't just hidden. It was buried deep, concealed by layers of fear and lies. But what exactly was Carl hiding, and why had he felt the need to spy on the Martins in such a meticulous way? Pierce's confrontation with Carl had only scratched the surface. He had admitted that the Martins had gotten too close to something they shouldn't have. But Carl had shut down before he could reveal any real details. The question remained, what had the Martins discovered that led them to disappear without a trace? And more importantly, who was Carl so afraid of? The discovery of Gregory Miller's involvement in Carl's life only deepened the mystery. Miller had been Brian Martin's business partner, someone who had seemed like an unlikely suspect at first, given their professional relationship. But seeing Miller in Carl's house raised more questions. What connection did he have to Carl, and how far did this web of deceit stretch? Pierce knew she had to dig into Miller's past. The more she learned about him, the more his connection to the Martins' disappearance made sense. Miller had always been a quiet presence in Oak Ridge, keeping to himself, handling the business side of things for the Martins. But there were whispers that he had been involved in shady deals, perhaps even running a side business that no one knew about. Pierce's next step was to find out more about Gregory Miller's personal life and any connections he had to Carl Hargrove. As Pierce reviewed Miller's financial records, she came across a few oddities. Large, unexplained deposits into his account, some of them linked to companies with no official records, companies that appeared and disappeared overnight. One of these companies had made payments to an anonymous account in Carl's name. The pieces were starting to come together. It seemed that Miller and Carl had been involved in something bigger, something that the Martins had accidentally uncovered. Pierce's breakthrough came when she revisited the security footage from Carl's house. She had been so focused on the footage of Carl and the Martins' house that she hadn't noticed something earlier. In the background of one of the tapes, there was a figure, someone who had come and gone at Carl's house on the night the Martins disappeared. The figure's face was partially obscured, but Pierce could make out a few distinctive features. Tall, with dark hair and a heavy-set build. She recognized the figure instantly. It was Alan Price. Price was a name Pierce had heard in passing, someone with a reputation for being involved in criminal activities in the surrounding counties. He was known for dealing with money laundering and racketeering, and his name had come up during the investigation, but Pierce had never made a direct connection between him and the Martins. But now, seeing him at Carl's house, it was clear that Price had something to do with the disappearance. Pierce didn't waste time. She reached out to her contacts in nearby cities, hoping to get more information on Price. What she found sent a chill down her spine. Alan Price had been linked to a series of illegal businesses that operated under the radar, and he had a history of silencing those who got too close to his operations. Price had been involved in numerous shady dealings, but what stood out was his connection to Gregory Miller. They had crossed paths several times in the past, and it seemed that their dealings went much deeper than Pierce had first realized. The more Pierce learned about Price, the clearer it became. The Martins' disappearance wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a targeted attack, orchestrated by people who stood to lose everything if the Martins exposed them. Brian Martin, it seemed, had been the one to uncover something that Price and Miller had been trying to keep hidden. The question was, what had Brian discovered, and why had it made him a target? Pierce's investigation took her to a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of Oak Ridge. It had been rented under a fake name, and records showed that both Carl and Gregory Miller had visited the warehouse in the days leading up to the Martins' disappearance. The warehouse, on the surface, appeared to be a simple storage facility, but Pierce knew better. This was where the answers lay. She gathered a small team and made her way to the warehouse, her heart pounding in her chest. This could be it, the moment she had been waiting for. As they approached the building, Pierce's instincts told her to be cautious. The area was isolated, and there were no signs of life. The warehouse itself was large, industrial, and cold, a place that felt out of place in Oak Ridge. It didn't belong in the quiet town, and neither did the secrets that might be waiting inside. With flashlights in hand, Pierce and her team cautiously entered the building. It was quiet, too quiet. The air smelled musty, and dust particles floated in the dim light. They moved carefully through the rows of old crates and boxes, looking for anything that could point to the Martins. Then, in the back corner of the warehouse, Pierce spotted something that made her stop dead in her tracks. A set of large crates, stacked high and covered with tarps. As Pierce approached, she saw that the tarps had been disturbed, ripped at the edges, as though someone had been in a hurry to hide something. Her heart raced as she pulled the tarp away. What she saw sent a shiver down her spine. Inside the crates were stacks of documents, business records, legal papers, and photographs. The documents were all related to a real estate venture involving Miller, Price, and several unknown individuals. But among the papers, Pierce found something far more shocking: photographs of the Martins. There were pictures of Brian and Alicia at work, in their home, and even at local restaurants. It was clear that someone had been watching them for a long time. Pierce's breath caught in her throat. The Martins had been targeted not because of their wealth or status, but because they had stumbled onto something much bigger, a conspiracy involving people in positions of power. And now the Martins were gone. The discovery was the breakthrough Pierce needed. The Martins hadn't just disappeared. They had been taken, and the people behind their disappearance were far more dangerous than she had imagined. But there was one more piece of the puzzle that remained. As Pierce continued to investigate the documents, she found a final, chilling entry, a note scribbled in the margin of one of the files. It read, "Get rid of them before they talk. We can't risk exposure." The message was clear. The Martins had been silenced to protect a secret that Pierce was determined to uncover. When you start pulling on the threads of a lie, you can never predict how far they'll stretch. Every answer only leads to more questions. And sometimes, the truth you uncover is the last thing you ever wanted to know. Detective Samantha Pierce had thought she was prepared for whatever she might find in the warehouse, but the contents of the crates, hidden surveillance footage, financial records, and the unsettling photographs of the Martins were more than she had anticipated. The discovery confirmed her worst suspicions. The Martins had been targeted because they had uncovered something they shouldn't have. Now the investigation had taken a dangerous turn. What had begun as a missing persons case had evolved into a conspiracy involving multiple players with far-reaching connections. Pierce's thoughts raced as she pieced together the new evidence. The documents and photographs linked the Martins to Alan Price and Gregory Miller, but there were also clues pointing to a third party, a shadowy figure whose identity remained unclear. What was most troubling was the timing of it all. The Martins had vanished not long after Brian Martin had started to question the legality of some of Miller and Price's business dealings. The message in the files was unmistakable. Get rid of them before they talk. Someone in the web of criminal activity knew that the Martins were getting too close to exposing a secret. And that secret was far bigger than anyone had initially realized. But as Pierce stood in the dimly lit warehouse, looking over the stolen photographs and documents, she knew this was only the beginning. The pieces were coming together, but the picture still wasn't clear. Who had orchestrated the disappearance? And how far would they go to keep their secrets buried? Pierce's mind kept returning to Carl Hargrove, the quiet neighbor who had always seemed so ordinary. Carl had been the first one to draw attention with his odd behavior and the hidden surveillance footage in his garage. But as she thought about it more, Pierce realized that Carl wasn't the mastermind. He was just a pawn in a much larger game. He had been used, manipulated by someone more powerful, someone who had orchestrated the entire thing. As Pierce pieced together the final moments of the Martins' lives, she recalled an interview with Carl's neighbor, Edna. The elderly woman had been living next door for years and knew Carl better than anyone else in the neighborhood. She had been an ever-present figure in Oak Ridge, watching the comings and goings of every neighbor, but she had always kept her distance from the Martins. However, Edna had said something peculiar during her interview that now stood out to Pierce. Carl was always careful around the Martins, Edna had said, but there was one time, just a few weeks before they disappeared, when I saw him talk to Brian. It wasn't just friendly chatter. Carl looked nervous, more than I'd ever seen him. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Nervous? Carl Hargrove had been a nervous man ever since Pierce started questioning him. But this was different. He had been agitated, trying to keep Brian from leaving. But why? What had happened in that conversation? Was Carl afraid of Brian knowing too much? Had Brian figured something out that Carl was desperate to cover up? Pierce decided it was time to pay another visit to Edna. Something in her words had triggered a connection that Pierce needed to explore further. Edna had seen Carl and Brian speak, and perhaps she knew more than she had let on. The next morning, Pierce returned to the quiet streets of Oak Ridge, the sun barely rising as she pulled up to Edna's house. The small, one-story cottage sat at the end of a tree-lined cul-de-sac, its windows framed with flower boxes and ivy. It looked peaceful, ordinary, like so many other homes in the neighborhood, but Pierce knew better. The secrets hidden within these walls were anything but ordinary. Edna answered the door with a wary smile, as if she had been expecting Pierce. The last conversation had been cordial, but something about Edna's demeanor now seemed different. More guarded, almost nervous. Pierce stepped inside, sensing the shift in the air. "I'm sorry to bother you again, Edna," Pierce began, "but I need you to think back. You said you saw Carl talking to Brian Martin before they disappeared. I need to know exactly what you saw. What was Carl saying?" Edna hesitated, her eyes flickering as she wrung her hands in front of her. "I'm not sure what it was, but when I looked out the window, I saw them talking. Carl didn't look angry, but he looked scared. Brian was calm, but Carl kept glancing around, like he was worried someone would see them." Pierce pressed on. "What else? Did Carl say anything specific?" Edna's voice trembled as she recalled the moment. "I don't know if it means anything, but Carl said they can't find out. It's too dangerous for everyone." He said something like that, and then Brian just walked away. I don't think Carl wanted him to leave. A chill ran down Pierce's spine as Edna's words sank in. Too dangerous for everyone. It was as if Carl had known exactly what the stakes were. That Brian had been asking too many questions, digging too deep, and now he had paid the price. The Martins hadn't just vanished. They had been targeted, and Carl had been caught in the middle. Pierce quickly thanked Edna and left, her mind racing with the new information. She had the answer she was looking for. Carl had been terrified that the Martins were onto something so dangerous that he had been trying to prevent them from uncovering it. But who had Carl been afraid of? Who was pulling the strings behind this operation? As she sat in her car, trying to piece together the growing web of deceit, her phone rang. It was Officer Samira Brooks. "Detective Pierce, you need to see this." Samira's voice crackled through the line. "Urgent. We've got a break in the case. You're going to want to come to the station right now." Pierce's heart skipped a beat as she hurried back to the station. When she arrived, Samira was waiting for her with a file in hand. She opened it slowly, her face serious. "Someone just came forward," Samira said. "Someone who knew Gregory Miller. They've been keeping quiet for months, but they've finally agreed to talk." Samira handed Pierce the file, and as she skimmed the notes, Pierce felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The witness had come forward with information that connected Gregory Miller to a string of illegal land deals, all linked to a shadowy organization that had been operating in the region for years. It was clear now Miller, Carl, and others were part of something much larger, and the Martins had been caught in the crossfire. What if the people who were meant to protect you, the ones you called your friends, were the very ones who led you into the darkness? What happens when the line between right and wrong disappears, and there's no turning back? Detective Samantha Pierce sat in the dimly lit conference room, surrounded by maps, photographs, and case files. The case had spiraled into something far darker than she had ever anticipated. When she first began investigating the disappearance of the Martins, she thought it would be a straightforward case of a family fleeing under pressure or a missing persons case with a simple explanation. But the more she uncovered, the more it became clear that this was no ordinary case. It was a web of deceit, manipulation, and corruption that reached further than she could have imagined. The new witness, someone with intimate knowledge of Gregory Miller's dealings, had come forward, and the information they provided was a game changer. The witness had confirmed that Miller had been working with several shadowy figures to manipulate land deals, siphon money through illegal means, and bury evidence of a network of criminal activities. But there was something more. Miller wasn't just a passive participant in these activities. He was at the center of it all, orchestrating many of the illegal transactions that had led to the Martins' sudden disappearance. Pierce's mind kept returning to the phrase that had haunted her from the beginning. Too dangerous for everyone, Carl Hargrove, despite his involvement, had been nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game. But the Martins? They had been far more than that. They had been targets, innocent, unsuspecting victims who had uncovered something they shouldn't have, something that could bring the entire operation crashing down. The question was, how deep did this conspiracy go? Was Gregory Miller the mastermind behind the entire scheme, or was he just another cog in a much larger, far more dangerous machine? Pierce had spent days poring over every lead, every piece of evidence, but it still felt like she was missing something. Something crucial that would tie all the pieces together. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was Officer Samira Brooks again. "Detective, you need to come down to the station. We've got something you need to see." Samira's voice was clipped, her tone urgent. Pierce grabbed her coat and made her way to the station, her heart pounding. When she arrived, Samira was already waiting with a new stack of files in her hands. Her expression was grim as she handed Pierce the documents. "I don't know what you'll make of this," Samira said, "but we've traced some more financial records. These are linked to Gregory Miller, but they go deeper than we thought." Pierce flipped through the files, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the pages. The records detailed payments that Miller had made to several different companies, some of which were located overseas. But what caught Pierce's attention was the last name that appeared on the list: Davidson. The payments made to this name were large, consistent, and oddly structured. "Davidson? Who's that?" Pierce asked, feeling a sense of déjà vu. The name rang a bell, but she couldn't place it. "That's the thing," Samira said. "We don't know who Davidson is, but we found a connection to Alan Price. It's possible this person is the person funding Miller's operation." Pierce's stomach turned. Alan Price had been the one to pull the strings in the past, and if he was tied to these mysterious payments, it meant that the conspiracy stretched even further. But who was this Davidson, and how were they connected to the Martins' disappearance? Pierce was determined to find the answer. She spent hours digging into Davidson's name, pulling up every record she could find. It wasn't long before she made a disturbing discovery. Davidson was a name that had appeared in several other investigations, all connected to a string of illegal activities involving money laundering, fraud, and land deals. What was most unsettling, however, was that Davidson had been involved in the same areas where Gregory Miller and Alan Price had been operating. The connection was becoming clearer. Davidson wasn't just some businessman looking to make a quick buck. He was deeply involved in organized crime, someone with connections that stretched into powerful circles, someone who had the resources to silence anyone who threatened to expose them. And now, the Martins had been caught in the middle of it all. The deeper Pierce went, the more the walls seemed to close in around her. The case was no longer just about the Martins. It was about something much bigger, something that could bring down an entire network of criminals if the right pieces fell into place. As Pierce pieced together the information, she realized that the Martins' disappearance had been no accident. It wasn't just about silencing them, it was about making an example of them. The Martins had stumbled onto something that could have exposed the entire operation, and that made them a threat. But there was still one question that Pierce couldn't answer. Where were they? Had they been killed, or had they been hidden away to ensure they never spoke again? Pierce knew that she had to find this Davidson, whoever he was, and uncover the final piece of the puzzle. She couldn't let the Martins' disappearance go unanswered. They deserved justice, and she was the only one who could bring it to them. The breakthrough came the following morning, when Samira called Pierce with urgent news. They had found Davidson's address. Davidson's estate was located on the outskirts of Oak Ridge, nestled in a secluded area that seemed out of place in the otherwise quiet town. It was a mansion, hidden behind high walls and thick trees, isolated from the rest of the community. This was the place where the people behind the Martins' disappearance had taken refuge, and it was where Pierce knew she would find the final answers. With a small team of officers, Pierce drove to the estate, her mind racing with what she might find. This was it, the end of the line. The truth was within reach, but she had to be careful. If Davidson was as dangerous as the record suggested, he wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to keep his secret safe. As they approached the gates of the estate, Pierce's hand tightened around the door handle. This could be the moment that changed everything. She signaled to her team, and together they made their way through the gate, ready to confront whoever was waiting on the other side.